The morning of August 7th, 1943, somewhere over the scorched earth of Tunisia, a Lockheed P-38 Lightning clawed its way toward 28,000 feet. Inside the cramped cockpit, Lieutenant James Harmon felt his aircraft shudder and gasp. The twin Allison engines, those magnificent turbocharged power plants that should have given him dominance at altitude, were failing him when he needed them most. Above him, barely visibly against the bleached African sky, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 turned lazily, effortlessly maintaining its position in the thinner air. The German pilot knew what Harmon was learning the hard way. At this altitude, the vaunted American Lightning was nothing more than an expensive coffin with wings. Harmon's throttles were pushed to their stops. His manifold pressure gauge flickered erratically. The intercooler system, designed to keep his supercharged engines running cool and powerful at altitude, had become his enemy. Entering his cylinders was too warm, robbing him of the power he desperately needed. Each time he tried to climb higher, detonation rattled through his engines like machine gun fire a sound every pilot dreaded, the sound of an engine tearing itself apart from the inside. Below him, the Mediterranean glittered like hammered bronze. Above him, the German fighter waited with infinite patience. The Lightning had been designed as a high-altitude interceptor, conceived in 1937 with the specific mission of engaging hostile aircraft at heights where other fighters could not follow. But something had gone catastrophically wrong between the drawing board and the battlefield, and men like Harmon were paying the price in blood and aluminum. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 3,000 miles away, in the cavernous factories of Burbank, California, engineers at Lockheed Aircraft Corporation believed they had created the perfect high-altitude fighter. The P-38 Lightning represented the cutting edge of American aviation technology. Its twin-boom design was radical, even revolutionary. While conventional fighters relied on a single engine, the Lightning mounted two Allison Pfeift 17-ton engines in streamlined nacelles, each equipped with a General Electric turbo supercharger, a complex mechanical symphony designed to compress thin, high-altitude air and force it into the engines at sea-level density, maintaining power where other aircraft suffocated. The design specification had been uncompromising. In February of 1937, the United States Army Air Corps issued Circular Proposal X608, demanding an interceptor capable of reaching 360 miles per hour at altitude and climbing to 20,000 feet within 6 minutes. These were the most demanding requirements the Air Corps had ever issued. The specifications called for liquid-cooled Allison engines with turbo superchargers, and Lockheed's response had been audacious. Chief Engineer Hall Hibbard and his brilliant protégé, Clarence Kelly Johnson, had conceived an aircraft that should have owned the sky at any altitude. On paper, the mathematics were flawless. The twin turbo superchargers would compress incoming air. The intercoolers would cool that compressed air to increase its density further, and the result would be an aircraft capable of fighting effectively at 40,000 feet or higher. When the first P-38 Segundo arrived in England in the summer of 1942, destined for the 8th Air Force, they were hailed as the answer to a desperate problem. American bombers were beginning their daylight campaign against German industry, flying deep into hostile airspace at altitudes above 25,000 feet. They needed escorts, capable of matching their altitude and staying with them all the way to the target and back. The P-38's range made it the only fighter in the European theatre capable of such missions. But within weeks, a disturbing pattern emerged. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters were consistently outclimbing them, gaining superior positions and turning the Americans' own altitude advantage against them. The problem revealed itself in the bitter cold of high-altitude European skies. At 30,000 feet over Germany, temperatures plunged to 40 or 50 degrees below zero. The P-38's intercooler system, mounted in the leading edges of the wings, proved tragically vulnerable to these conditions. The intercooler was designed with a thermostatic valve that regulated how much cooling the compressed air received before entering the engine. In theory, this valve should have maintained optimal charge air temperature regardless of ambient conditions. In practice, it became a mechanical nightmare. The valve would freeze open, overcooling the charge air, or it would freeze closed, allowing the air to enter the cylinders too warm. Either condition was catastrophic. Overcooled air caused the fuel-air mixture to become unstable, resulting in rough running and power loss. Overheated air caused detonation uncontrolled explosion of the fuel-air mixture that could destroy an engine in minutes. Pilots reported increasingly dire experiences. The engines would run roughly, misfiring and backfiring. Manifold pressure would fluctuate wildly. Worst of all, when pilots pushed their throttles forward to climb or engage the enemy, they would hear the distinctive rattle of detonation, a sound one pilot described as someone inside the engine with a ball-peen hammer, trying to smash their way out. Many P-38s returned to base with cylinders cracked, pistons damaged, and in some cases, complete engine. Failures that left pilots limping home on one engine, losing altitude and speed, easy prey for any German fighter that happened upon them. The official reports piled up at 8th Air Force headquarters. The P-38 lightning groups were suffering casualties at rates that could not be sustained. In some engagements, entire formations found themselves unable to climb above 25,000 feet with any reliability. German pilots quickly learned that the fork-tailed American fighter could be beaten simply by climbing. Lieutenant General Adolf Galland, commander of the Luftwaffe fighter forces, was dismissive. The P-38 had similar shortcomings to the German Bf-110, he noted, and German fighters were clearly superior. German pilots reported that Lightnings were easy to outmaneuver at altitude and represented assured victories. Back in the United States, Lockheed's engineers scrambled to understand what was going wrong. Test flights in California, where temperatures were moderate even, at altitude, had revealed no significant problems. The issue was specific to the European theater, specific to prolonged operations in intensely cold conditions. The company began working on modifications, but the process was slow. Design changes had to be tested, approved, and then implemented on production lines already running at full capacity. Meanwhile, in England, Lightning pilots were dying. By early 1943, some P-38 groups were being withdrawn from high-altitude escort duties and reassigned to lower-altitude missions where the intercooler problems were less severe. It was a humiliating admission that America's most technologically advanced fighter could not perform the mission for which it had been designed. The 8th Air Force began pushing for more Republic P-37 Thunderbolts and eagerly awaited the arrival of the North American P-50 Mustang with its British Merlin engine and two-stage supercharger. The P-38, it seemed, had been tried in the crucible of European combat and found wanting. But 3,000 miles to the south, in the dust and heat of North Africa, a different story was unfolding. The North African campaign presented its own unique challenges for aviation. The relentless sun heated metal surfaces to temperatures that could blister exposed skin. Fine sand infiltrated every mechanical system, abrading moving parts and clogging filters. The distances were vast missions, often covered hundreds of miles over terrain that offered no place for an emergency landing. Yet, paradoxically, P-38, operating from North African bases, were experiencing far fewer of the altitude performance problems that plagued their counterparts in England. The warmer temperatures meant that intercooler systems rarely froze. The shorter, more tactical nature of most North African missions meant less time at extreme altitude, and the Luftwaffe opposition, while skilled, was increasingly stretched thin as German forces retreated westward across Libya and Tunisia. It was in this environment, far from Lockheed's factories, far from the oversight of Army Air Forces headquarters, far from the theoretical calculations of engineers, that innovation emerged from necessity. At a forward repair depot in Tunisia, the P-38 that limped back from combat were patched up by maintenance crews working in conditions that would have horrified factory inspectors. These mechanics worked under canvas awnings, stretched between damaged aircraft, using improvised tools, operating on aircraft that had been shot full of holes, burned, stressed beyond design limits. They learned the P-38s systems intimately, not from technical manuals, but from the brutal education of keeping shot-up aircraft flying with whatever materials and ingenuity they possessed. One of these men was a staff sergeant whose name has been largely lost to history, though his contribution altered the course of aerial warfare. He was assigned to one of the forward maintenance units, part of the unglamorous but essential infrastructure that kept fighters in the air. Every day, he watched P-38s return from missions with engines running rough, manifold pressure gauges reading erratically, pilots reporting sluggish performance at altitude. He had read the technical orders from Lockheed, studied the intercooler system diagrams, listened to the theories about why the system wasn't working as designed. But unlike the engineers in California, he had the advantage of seeing dozens of different aircraft, flown by different pilots under different conditions, all exhibiting variations of the same fundamental problem. The intercooler system's thermostatic valve was, he concluded, more liability than asset. In theory, the valve's job was to regulate cooling. In practice, it was a temperamental mechanism that added complexity and introduced failure points. The valve could stick partially open or closed. It could respond too slowly to changing conditions. It could freeze or overheat. And most damningly, it created a restriction in the airflow system. The compressed air from the turbo supercharger had to pass through the valve assembly before reaching the intercooler, and that passage introduced resistance, reducing the system's overall efficiency. The sergeant began experimenting. On one damaged P-38 that had returned with a shot-up intercooler system, he bypassed the thermostatic valve entirely, creating a direct path for air to flow from the turbo supercharger into the intercooler and then into the engine. It was a modification that violated official technical procedures. It eliminated a system that Lockheed's engineers had designed for what they considered good reasons. If the modification caused an engine failure, the sergeant could face court-martial for unauthorized alterations to critical aircraft systems. But when the modified aircraft was test-flown, the results were immediate and dramatic. The pilot reported that the engines ran smoother than any P-38 he had flown. Manifold pressure was stable. Most remarkably, when he pushed the aircraft into a climb at altitude, there was no detonation rattle, no hesitation, just smooth, powerful acceleration. The modified Lightning climbed to 30,000 feet and kept going, passing through altitudes where standard P-38 would be gasping and struggling. At 35,000 feet, the aircraft was still climbing strongly. Performance that had been theoretical was suddenly real. Word spread through the maintenance crews with the speed that good news always travels among men fighting a war. Other mechanics examined the modification, understood its elegant simplicity, and began implementing it on their own aircraft. Pilots who flew the modified P-38 reported consistent performance improvements. Climb rate increased by approximately 15%. At altitude, the engines produced roughly 200 additional horsepower, a massive improvement that transformed the aircraft's combat capability. Suddenly, P-38 could climb with and above the Messerschmitt 109s that had been dominating them. They could maintain power at altitudes where they had previously been helpless. The modification spread informally, passed from mechanic to mechanic, depot to depot, a grassroots revolution happening far from official channels. Squadron commanders, seeing the results in combat, quietly encouraged their maintenance crews to implement the change. Some pilots began specifically requesting modified aircraft. Within weeks, a significant percentage of the P-38 operating in the Mediterranean theater had been altered in this unauthorized but highly effective manner. The fork-tailed fighters that had been struggling were suddenly competitive, even dominant in the North African skies. But this grassroots success posed a problem for the Army Air Forces and for Lockheed. Officially, the modification was unauthorized. It bypassed engineered safety systems. It had not undergone the rigorous testing that normally preceded any change to aircraft systems. Engineering theory suggested it should cause problems without the thermostatic valve. Charge air temperature would not be regulated, potentially leading to overcooling in cold conditions or overheating in warm conditions. Yet empirically, undeniably, it was working. The modified P-38s were outperforming standard aircraft by a significant margin, and doing so without the engine failures that theory predicted. Senior officers faced a dilemma. They could not officially endorse an unauthorized modification, but neither could they ignore its effectiveness. Combat results spoke with an authority that transcended technical manuals. The Lightning groups operating in the Mediterranean were achieving success ratios that their counterparts in England could only envy. On April 5, 1943, 26 P-38s intercepted a massive German formation of 50 to 70 Junkers Ju-52. Transports escorted by approximately 30 fighters and dive bombers. The action, which would become known as the Palm Sunday Massacre, resulted in the destruction of numerous German aircraft for minimal American losses. The P-38s ability to maintain altitude and power throughout the engagement had been crucial to the victory. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Eventually, the unofficial modification could no longer be ignored. Army Air Forces technical officers visited the North African maintenance depots, examined the modified aircraft, interviewed the mechanics and pilots. They found no evidence of increased engine failures. They found no evidence of operational problems. What they found was consistent improvement in combat effectiveness. The evidence was irrefutable. A staff sergeant working in a dusty maintenance depot with improvised tools had solved a problem that had stumped Lockheed's engineering department. The official investigation into the North African modification revealed something that made Lockheed's engineers simultaneously embarrassed and enlightened. The thermostatic valve they had designed was solving a problem that, in most operational conditions, did not actually exist. The engineers had assumed that unregulated intercooler airflow would create wild temperature fluctuations that would damage engines or reduce performance. But the staff sergeant's field experience had revealed a different truth. The turbo supercharger and intercooler system, when allowed to operate without the restriction of the thermostatic valve, naturally self-regulated to a remarkable degree. The mass airflow through the system, the heat exchange properties of the intercooler cores, and the engine's own fuel-air mixture controls combined to create a system that was inherently more stable without the valve than with it. The restriction caused by the valve had been, to reducing manifold pressure, the critical measure of how much air was being forced into the engine cylinders. By eliminating that restriction, the bypass modification allowed higher manifold pressure, which directly translated to more power. The cooler charge air temperatures that resulted from unrestricted intercooler airflow increased air density, packing more oxygen molecules into each cylinder, allowing more fuel to be burned, generating more power. It was a cascading series of improvements, each building on the last, and the cumulative effect was transformative. What made the discovery particularly significant was what it revealed about the relationship between engineering, theory, and operational reality. Lockheed's designers had worked in wind tunnels and test facilities, using the best scientific understanding available. They had calculated heat transfer coefficients, modeled airflow dynamics, and designed a system that should have been optimal, but they had designed it for idealized conditions, steady-state operations, controlled environments, predictable variables. Combat was none of those things. Combat involved violent maneuvers, rapid altitude changes, extreme temperature variations, sustained high-power operations far beyond normal test parameters. The staff sergeant in Tunisia had not possessed advanced engineering degrees or access to sophisticated testing equipment. What he possessed was direct observation of the system failing under operational stress and the practical wisdom to recognize that sometimes the solution to a complex problem is to remove the complexity. By late 1943, Lockheed had begun incorporating variants of the field modification into production aircraft. The P-38J model, which entered service in the spring of 1944, featured a completely redesigned intercooler system. The new system relocated the intercoolers from the wing, leading edges to the underside of the engine nacelles where they could be, larger and more efficient. More critically, the new design eliminated the problematic thermostatic valve in favor of a system that allowed more direct airflow. The changes also included revised ducting that reduced restrictions and improved charge air cooling. Engineering analysis confirmed what the field modification had demonstrated empirically. Unrestricted intercooler airflow provided better performance and greater reliability than the original regulated system. The P-38J represented a wholesale transformation of the Lightning's high-altitude capability. Official specifications listed a top speed of 414 miles per hour and a service ceiling of 44,000 feet. In practice, pilots found the J model could maintain combat effectiveness at altitudes where earlier P-38s had been nearly helpless. The improved intercooler system meant that the turbo superchargers could finally deliver their designed performance. Manifold pressure remained stable, even during violent combat maneuvers. The detonation problems that had plagued earlier models virtually disappeared. Engine reliability improved dramatically. Pilots no longer feared that pushing their throttles forward at altitude would result in catastrophic engine failure. The transformation was particularly evident in the Mediterranean theater, where P-38J and L models began arriving in late 1944. These aircraft, incorporating all the lessons learned from the North African field modifications, dominated the skies over Italy and southern Europe. The Lightning groups flying from Italian bases could escort bombers all the way to targets in southern Germany, Austria, and the Balkans, maintaining formation at altitudes above 30,000 feet for hours at a time. German pilots, who had once dismissed the P-38 as easy prey, found themselves facing an entirely different adversary. The fork-tailed American fighter could now climb with anything the Luftwaffe possessed, could fight, effectively at any altitude, and possessed range that made interception planning nearly impossible. In the Pacific theater, where the P-38 had always performed better due to warmer operating temperatures, the improved models were even more dominant. The turbo-supercharged Lightnings operated at altitudes where Japanese fighters, which lacked effective high-altitude supercharging, could not follow. American pilots learned to use their altitude advantage ruthlessly, diving from above 30,000 feet to attack Japanese formations, then climbing back to altitude where pursuit was impossible. Major Richard Bong, America's highest-scoring ace with 40 confirmed victories, flew P-38 exclusively. Major Thomas Maguire, with 38 victories, also flew Lightnings. Both men exploited the aircraft's high-altitude performance to devastating effect, using tactics that would have been impossible in the earlier intercooler-limited models. The field modification's impact extended beyond immediate combat effectiveness. It represented a fundamental challenge to the traditional relationship between engineering design and operational employment. In the hierarchical world of military aviation, innovation was supposed to flow from the top down, from research laboratories to engineering departments to factories to operational units. The North African modification reversed that flow. Innovation had emerged from the bottom up, from mechanics working in field conditions, and had proven superior to the carefully engineered systems created by credentialed experts in controlled environments. This reversal carried implications that made military bureaucrats uncomfortable. If a staff sergeant could solve a problem that Lockheed's engineers had failed to solve, what did that say about the engineering process? If unauthorized field modifications improved performance, should they be encouraged rather than prohibited? The questions threatened established procedures and challenged assumptions about expertise and authority. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The modified aircraft performed better. Pilots survived who might otherwise have died. Missions succeeded that might otherwise have failed. In warfare, results matter more than procedures, and the results of the North African modification were written in the smoking wreckage of German aircraft scattered across the Mediterranean. The Army Air Force's response was pragmatic, if somewhat grudging. Field modifications that improved performance without compromising safety would be tolerated, even quietly encouraged. Technical orders were revised to allow maintenance units more discretion in addressing operational problems. The rigid adherence to factory specifications was relaxed in favor of a more empirical approach. This shift represented a quiet revolution in military aviation maintenance philosophy, one that would have lasting implications for how aircraft were modified and improved throughout the remainder of the war and beyond. For Lockheed, the lesson was both humbling and invaluable. The company's engineers gained newfound respect for operational feedback from field units. The process of designing the P-38s J and L models involved extensive consultation with maintenance personnel and combat pilots, rather than relying solely on theoretical calculations and test flight data. This collaboration between designers and operators produced aircraft that were not just theoretically superior, but practically effective under combat conditions. The P-38s, the final and most produced variant with over 3,800 built, incorporated dozens of improvements that originated from field observations rather than engineering calculations. The production numbers told their own story. By the time production ceased in August of 1945, Lockheed had built approximately 10,000 P-38s Lightnings of all variants. The aircraft had been used in every theater of the war, in roles ranging from fighter interceptor to fighter bomber, from photo reconnaissance to night fighter. It had served with distinction from the Aleutians to North Africa, from the English Channel to New Guinea. The fork-tailed fighter that had struggled in its first combat deployments had evolved into one of the war's most versatile and effective combat aircraft, and that evolution owed much to an unnamed staff, surgeons' willingness to bypass a thermostatic valve in a dusty North African maintenance depot. The individual stories embedded within this larger narrative revealed the human dimension of technological warfare. Lieutenant James Harmon, the pilot who had struggled to climb above 28,000 feet in the opening scene, survived the war. In late 1943, his squadron received modified P-38s with the intercooler bypass. Harmon later reported that the first time he flew one of the modified aircraft, he took it to 35,000 feet just to prove to himself that it could be done. The engines ran smoothly, powerfully, without the detonation rattle that had once terrified him. When he encountered a Messerschmitt 109 at altitude weeks later, he found he could stay with the German fighter in a climb, could maintain energy in maneuvering flight, could fight on equal terms at heights where he had once been helpless. He shot down 3 German aircraft before the war ended, modest numbers perhaps, but representative of how technological improvement translated directly into combat effectiveness and survival. The mechanics who had implemented and spread the modification received little recognition. Military bureaucracy had no category for honoring unauthorized field modifications, no medals for violating technical procedures, even when those violations saved lives. The staff sergeant who first bypassed the intercooler valve remained anonymous, his innovation, attributed in official histories to field maintenance units or operational experience rather than individual ingenuity. Yet, his contribution was real and measurable. Every P-38s pilot who flew a J or L model, every mission flown at altitudes the early models could not sustain, every German aircraft shot down by a Lightning that could finally fight at its designed performance level, all bore the invisible signature of that unnamed sergeant's practical wisdom. The broader lesson transcended the specific case of the P-38s intercooler system. Complex machines operated under combat stress behave differently than the same machines operated under test conditions. Engineering optimization for laboratory environments did not necessarily translate to optimization for operational environments, and the men who operated and maintained equipment in the field developed knowledge that was different in kind, not just degree, from the knowledge possessed by designers and engineers. That field knowledge was empirical, practical, grounded in observation of how systems actually behaved rather than how theory suggested they should behave. This tension between theoretical design and practical operation had existed throughout the history of military technology, but it had rarely been resolved so clearly in favor of operational wisdom. The P-38 intercooler modification became a case study used in post-war analyses of weapons development, an example of how excessive complexity could degrade performance, how engineered solutions could create problems they were meant to solve, and how operational feedback needed to be integrated into design processes rather than treated as an afterthought. The lessons learned influenced everything from jet engine development in the late 1940s to missile guidance systems in the 1950s to the fighter aircraft designs of the Cold War era. In the immediate context of World War II, the modification's impact was measured in missions, flown and battles won. The P-38 groups operating from Italy in 1944 and early 1945 provided escort for the strategic bombing campaign against German oil, production facilities, aircraft factories, and transportation networks. They flew in the bitter cold at altitudes above 30,000 feet, maintaining formation for hours, the kind of operations that had been nearly impossible for early model Lightnings. The improved high-altitude performance meant that German fighters could not simply climb above the escorts to attack the bombers. The Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s had to fight through the P-38, and increasingly they found themselves unable to do so. The Lightning Group's kill ratios improved steadily through late 1944 and into 1945, reflecting not just pilot experience, but the aircraft's enhanced capabilities. The Pacific Theater saw similar results. The vast distances and extended over water, flights characteristic of the Pacific campaign, had always favored the long-range P-38, but the improved high-altitude performance of the J and L models gave American pilots an even greater advantage. Japanese fighters, designed for maneuverability at low and medium altitudes, were largely helpless against Lightnings attacking from above 30,000 feet. The P-38 could dive from altitude, make a single high-speed firing pass, and climb back to altitude before Japanese fighters could respond. This altitude advantage, made possible by the improved intercooler system, became a standard American tactic throughout the island-hopping campaign. By the time the Philippines were liberated in early 1945, P-38 operating from advanced bases were ranging over the Japanese home islands, conducting long-range reconnaissance and fighter sweeps at altitudes Japanese defenses could not effectively counter. The reconnaissance variants of the P-38, designated F4 and F5, benefited, particularly from the intercooler improvements. These aircraft, stripped of armament and fitted with cameras, depended on speed and altitude for survival. The ability to fly above 40,000 feet meant they could overfly heavily defended targets with relative impunity. Allied photo reconnaissance, which was crucial for targeting strategic bombing and planning amphibious operations, relied heavily on these high-flying Lightnings. 90% of the aerial photography taken over Europe during the war was captured by F4 and F5 variants. Their ability to reach and sustain extreme altitudes was directly attributable to the intercooler system improvements that began with a staff sergeant's unauthorized modification in North Africa. By the war's end, the P-38 Lightning had compiled a combat record that vindicated its original design concept while acknowledging the critical role of operational innovation. The aircraft had been conceived as a high-altitude interceptor, struggled in, that role due to intercooler problems, and ultimately fulfilled its design mission after field modifications corrected the engineering shortcomings. The journey from concept to effective combat weapon had been longer and more difficult than anyone anticipated, but the destination validated both the original vision and the practical wisdom of the men who made that vision work under combat conditions. The irony was profound and instructive. The most technologically advanced American fighter of the early war years, designed by brilliant engineers using the best scientific knowledge available, had required intervention by mechanics with hand tools to achieve its full potential. The sophisticated intercooler system, carefully engineered to regulate charge air temperature, worked better when that regulation was bypassed. The complex thermostatic valve, intended to optimize performance, was itself the primary obstacle to optimal performance. Sometimes, the solution to engineering complexity was elegant simplicity, and sometimes that simplicity could only be discovered through the harsh education of operational experience. As the final P-38s rolled off Lockheed's production line in August of 1945, days after Japan's surrender, it incorporated dozens of improvements that traced their lineage to field modifications and operational feedback. The intercooler system that had once been the aircraft's greatest weakness had become one of its greatest strengths. The fork-tailed fighter that German pilots had once dismissed as easy prey had become one of the most feared aircraft in the Allied arsenal. And somewhere in the vast bureaucratic archives of World War II maintenance reports, buried in technical language and official memoranda, was the anonymous contribution of a staff sergeant who had looked at a malfunctioning system, understood that the solution was to remove rather than repair, and changed the course of aerial warfare through simple, practical wisdom. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.